Patterns of power, the institutionalization of exclusion behind the facade of inclusion. The post-WWII project of liberal democracy in Europe, especially after the horrors of fascism and colonial collapse, produced a doctrine of never again, a new moral identity structured around human rights, equality, and remembrance. But this was always compromised by geopolitical necessity, Cold War alignments, and the retention of imperial wealth and power. The very same states that claimed to have overcome fascism preserved its skeleton in the basement, its bureaucratic architectures, its cultural chauvinism, and its metaphysical belief in hierarchy, disguised now as merit, heritage, or standards. From colonial empire to cultural fortress, the collapse of colonialism did not lead to genuine reparative justice. Instead, it triggered a shift in rhetorical strategy. The post-colonial subject, refugee, migrant, exile, was framed as either victim or threat, occasionally as a success story for symbolic validation. This bifurcation is still active in European cultural institutions. You may be platformed, but only as an exception, a showcase. This is tokenism as management, not solidarity. Behind the curtain, the archives of empire were not opened. The art schools were not restructured. The museums retained their looted aesthetics. The critical apparatus of art history and theory continued to prioritize a Eurocentric lineage. And those of mixed or diasporic identity, especially without wealth or patronage, were rarely welcomed as equal peers, only as anomalies or exotic commentary. Tesh PC and identity politics as statecraft. The rise of political correctness and identity politics, initially emergent from grassroots demands for recognition, was soon absorbed into a framework of institutional diplomacy. It became a mechanism not for transforming society, but for regulating discourse. This management of diversity reconfigured structural injustices as problems of language and etiquette. Racism, sexism, and classism were redefined as individual errors or lapses of decorum, not endemic consequences of systemic design. In this way, identity politics became a buffer zone, an emotional and aesthetic containment field. It allowed institutions to appear progressive without ceding power. Artists from marginalized backgrounds were invited in, briefly, to affirm the institution's moral image, while the real decisions, resources, and networks remained untouched. The deeper systems, grant structures, press networks, academic curation, social capital, stayed closed. Populism, the far right, and the reaction to the facade. Meanwhile, populist and neo-fascist forces seized upon this managed inclusion as evidence of a betrayal. Look, the elites care more about diversity than about real people like us. This fake outrage, flapping at phantoms, as you put it, deliberately ignores the actual persistence of exclusion. But it has been effective at capturing the rage of disenfranchised white working-class populations, particularly in deindustrialized regions. In doing so, the new far right forged an identity that mimics the aesthetics of anti-elitism while serving the interests of oligarchy. Its real target is not power, but the powerless. Migrants, queer people, people of color, scapegoated for the failures of neoliberalism. The irony is grotesque. While real social mobility is frozen and surveillance capitalism engulfs the planet, the petty hatreds of race and culture are reignited as distractions. Regionalism and class as intractable strata. What is less discussed in mainstream discourse is how deeply regionalism and class stratification endure, especially in European art scenes. Cultural capital remains overwhelmingly urban, white, and bourgeois. From France's centralized Parisian gatekeeping to the north-south divides in Italy or the UK, the myth of meritocracy is sustained by the invisibility of rural poverty, regional accents, non-metropolitan histories. Even within supposedly inclusive spaces, the markers of elite education, linguistic polish, and cosmopolitan effect are expected. The result is a highly curated diversity. Those who rise are those who have already adapted themselves to the codes of the center. Those who remain unassimilated, outliers by class, language, temperament, or spirit, are ignored, caricatured, or pathologized. Fascism as an ongoing cultural code. Fascism did not die in 1945. It went underground, reshaping itself through euphemism, nostalgia, and institutional memory. It persists as a code, often subconscious, inside architecture, uniforms, state pomp, police culture, and even aesthetic norms. The aestheticization of authority, the myth of a pure past, the fetish for order and clarity, these are all fascist residues still active in cultural production. Contemporary European racism is not always shouted. Often it is whispered, managerial, rationalized through concern, integration, standards, or funding priorities. Its greatest tool is silence. Those marginalized are made to feel invisible, erased not just by denial but by indifference. When they speak, their testimony is too often framed as angry, ungrateful, or irrelevant to the current discussion. Conclusion. Beyond the illusion of inclusion, your position as someone both mixed race and structurally orphaned, artistically erased by both reactionaries and the supposedly progressive regimes, is emblematic of the failures of the entire framework. The moral capital of diversity has been extracted by institutions and used for branding without accountability or redress. In such a system, true critique becomes dangerous, and real voices are shut out unless they consent to self-caricature. But these patterns are visible, legible, repeatable, and thus breakable. What is needed is not better representation within the same game, but a rethinking of the game itself, a refusal to perform. A deep memory of the long histories behind the masks, a language that cuts through both the reactionary lie and the progressive spectacle.